So I'm really excited to introduce Lisa Kretz. Lisa is a professor of philosophy at the University of Evansville, and they are an activist with a whole portfolio of publications on hope, action, and ecological emotions, including, I'm going to read off a few: Climate Change, Bridging the Theory-Action Gap, Emotional Solidarity, Ecological Emotional Outlaws, Mourning Environmental Loss and Empowering Positive Change. I think that's my favorite title. Another on hope in environmental philosophy, and a last I'll mention titled Singing Hope's Praises, a defense of the virtue of hope for environmental action. And this is just a very small snapshot of Lisa's work, which also includes over 100 presentations and public lectures on these topics. And I just want to say I'm especially excited to hear from Lisa because she was supposed to be one of our headliners as a speaker at the Existential Toolkit conference in Munich before COVID happened. So I am really grateful that we finally get to hear about their work after a very long wait. So with that, Lisa, I will hand the screen over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Jennifer, and congratulations, Tanu and Ellen and Heidi. That's such wonderful news. This is a fantastic group, and I expect that just greater things will continue to happen as time unfolds. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm just going to change the display. There we go. So yes, we're going to be talking about affect or emotion in the classroom this morning. We'll start with a little practice. What I'm going to ask you to do is, if you have a sheet of paper in front of you, just take a moment to write down. You might want to not use paper. You might want to jot it in your phone. What are some of the things that are taking up space in your mind this morning? What are some of those thoughts that are running through? They might be worries, they might be excitements. Just jot those down. And when you're done, if you're writing, what I'm going to ask you to do is just fold your paper in half and put it to the side. If you're putting it into your phone, maybe you want to put brackets around it. And what I'm going to invite you to do is just whatever's taking up that space, we're just going to put it to the side for now. You can come back to it when we're done. I'm sure they'll continue to surface, but for now, it's just an invitation to place those to the side for a little while. And we're going to do a short meditation. When Ellen facilitated, she invited a short meditation, which was lovely and such a surprise. I wasn't expecting it. I was like, oh, I get to meditate. I've got an ulterior motive, and that this is going to tie into something that I'm going to talk about later. But what we're going to do is part of the Vipassana tradition. And if you're uncomfortable with Buddhism, you can think of it as just mindfulness. This is a regular run-of-the-mill mindfulness sort of meditation. And you're going to want to get comfortable, not be rigid in posture, but also not be slumping. So get comfortable. And our mind does what minds do, which is to have a thought, and then another thought, and then another thought. And in this particular meditation practice, what you do is you focus on the breath. Some people like to focus on the feeling of the breath coming in and out of the nostrils or the mouth. Other people like to focus on the rise and fall of the abdomen. But what you're going to do is every time a thought arises, and they will, because that's what our minds do, you're very gently going to let go of that thought. Sometimes people like to imagine it as a bubble, a thought bubble, and then you take a feather and you just very gently tap the thought bubble and it explodes. Gently, gentle explosion. Yep, that makes lots of sense. And you let it go and you just come back to your breath. So we won't do this for very long, but I'll start with a little chime. We'll do the meditation practice and we can end with a chime. So welcome. It's really important with this exercise to be gentle with yourself. One of the things that Pema Chodron said that I just loved was, so if you're unfamiliar, Pema Chodron is this big deal Buddhist practitioner, and they said they sat down for a sit, they rang the chime, and Pema's mind started running, and it ran an hour straight, and then Pema heard the chime again, and what she said was, that was success. When I heard the second chime I came to, I was mindful of the fact that I had been thinking. And for me, that's really important because I am a chronic thinker. I mean, I'm a philosopher for crying out loud. So being really gentle with the fact that that is what your mind does, but we can still invite a little bit of quiet from time to time. Okay. So this is going to be old hat for some folks, but hopefully new to others. These are some fairly well established, I'd make the case, feminist arguments with regard to the reason-emotion dualism. So we're going to be talking about emotion, we're going to be talking about affect today, and I just wanted to flag some of what's often going on in the background of these discussions. So on the right, you can see a grid with terms on the right and terms on the left. Now the terms on the left tend to be elevated in stature. They're treated as being superior in relationship to the things on the right, which are treated as being inferior. So this is a series of value hierarchical dualisms. There's values associated with these concepts, and they're differentially valued in terms of their superiority and inferiority. And I'm sure these are familiar to you in the Western traditions of masculinity, femininity, reason, emotion, public, private, aggressive, nurturing, active, passive, clear, vague, mind, matter, and rational, irrational. And insofar as everything gets lumped together on either side, there's real concerns about how emotion gets conceptualized. I'd make the case this is a series of false dichotomies. We don't need to treat the world as though these things are opposites and one is better than the other. And insofar as they're adopted, there's a perpetuation of systematic ignorance around how we think about emotion, and it still shapes curriculum, pedagogy, and epistemology. Megan Bowler's book, Feeling Power, is great in terms of making this case, and epistemology, if you're unfamiliar, is theory of knowledge. So in philosophy, epistemology refers to theory of knowledge. And the way that we think about these concepts shapes possibilities in and out of the classroom. So here's one of the ways the relationship gets conceptualized, which is quite antagonistic. This one cracks me up. It's actually on my fridge. Here's another way of thinking about it. So in the book that the content of this presentation comes from, I invite readers to think about what becomes possible when reason and emotion are seen as acting perhaps in a friendly way with each other. It's necessary for reason and emotion to work well the vast majority of the time for us to function as human beings, yet when we're thinking about it in this antagonistic way, that's not really what's flagged. And contra the view that emotions subvert knowledge, I would make the case that they're absolutely essential to knowledge claims. So these are just a few examples. Emotions are recognized as directing our attention, marking patterns of salience. The last point is that they're evolutionarily adaptive responses to events. And think about this for a second. If you didn't have emotions to direct yourself to what's valuable in any given moment, in any given environment, you just have this blooming, buzzing confusion of data entering, right? You need to be able to distill and identify what's salient to you, and emotions help with that. Emotions themselves must world map. They must be attuned in reliable ways, or they aren't useful. They wouldn't function as concepts if they weren't successfully mapping the world in a variety of ways. They're socially constructed, so you can think about how you come to understand emotions when children are quite young. If something unfortunate happens and somebody starts crying, you're like, oh, you're sad right now. This is what we refer to as sadness. And insofar as we create them, they could be otherwise. We could map other elements. I'd make the case that we have a pretty limited vocabulary when it comes to emotion. I'd also make the case that emotional intelligence is underdeveloped. You can think about what we teach our kids at school. What we tend to focus on is being relevant and objective. So thinking about that social construction is important. And emotions are sensitive to information. They're subject to refinement and they're subject to rethinking. So one of the ways this is discussed is through analysis of cognitive emotions. These are emotions that necessarily have a belief element. One of the classic examples is anger. When you're angry, it's about something going on in the world. There's a belief attached to it. And if the thing that you're angry about ends up not being the case, that something else had happened, that anger can dissipate. So there's absolutely a cognitive element where you're making an assessment and it's also subject to change. Also, I think worth flagging is the motivational function of emotion. Within the Western tradition, at least within dominant forms of teaching, there's this assumption that there's knowledge that you share with students, and once you share that knowledge, there's going to be an attitude shift that reflects that knowledge and behavior that reflects that knowledge. Study after study, especially in the environmental literature, shows this is false. Just because you know something to be right environmentally does not in any way guarantee that you will engage in behavior that reflects that. It would be so much easier if it did. So I talk a lot in my research about the theory-action gap, the gap between our theoretically espoused beliefs and the actions that would reflect those beliefs. In terms of illustrating the theory-action gap, perfect moral reasoning does not equate with perfect behavior. And when it comes to behavior, you actually need that motivating force of emotion. If you're talking about action, if you're talking about behavior in the world, in the absence of emotion, you don't have an impetus for doing X instead of Y. Hume famously argues this with regard to emotion. They're absolutely necessary for action in the world, and there's all kinds of moral psychology that bears this out. So I'd make the case that emotion is always already playing a role in the classroom. It's already there. We talked a little bit at one of the previous sessions about how when we're talking about grave emotional injustices, it can be very emotionally evocative for us as teachers, and there's a real reticence to sharing that emotional response because it's going to be seen as being irrational, not sufficiently objective. And what we're encouraged to believe is that we should remove emotion from the classroom. I'd make the case it's always already there. You might be suppressing and denying it and avoiding it, but it's there. It's part of who and what we are as human beings. I'd also make the case that affective pedagogy is necessary for effective pedagogy. You are ignoring half minimally of human experience when it comes to reason and emotion when you're not attending to emotion in the classroom. It's so crucial to knowledge claims. It's so crucial to action. It's actually suspect that we don't engage with it more. I'd make the case in the classroom. So when it comes to students, again, this is all in the Western paradigm. Currently, students are taught to largely, for the most part, discipline, control, and suppress their emotions. But as I just suggested, emotions serve as motivation for action and are sources of knowledge. I don't find this to be surprising given the neoliberal model of education, that we're encouraged to educate in ways that don't empower our students to go out in the world and make significant change. So just being mindful of why this is the model that we're working with. And so many of us, myself included, for years and years and years, ascribed to, thinking this is the way it's supposed to be done. With regard to students, anyone who teaches knows that strong emotional responses to feedback and assessment are part of what happens with students. And emotional upset can interfere with the student's mental life. So when folks are anxious, angry, or depressed, they do not take in information efficiently or deal with it well. So when you're not dealing with your students' emotional well-being, that can take away from their ability to learn in really robust ways. When it comes to thinking about emotion in the classroom, I tend to gravitate towards positive psychology models. So you see what works and you build on it. And when it comes to positive emotions in the classroom, they broaden scopes of attention and cognition. They enable flexible and creative thinking, and they enhance well-being and resilience. Positive affect promotes efficiency and thoroughness in decision-making, facilitates effective coping, and reduces defensiveness when facing adverse events. So if we're looking to cultivate this in the learning environment, there's research that supports the import of this. Also, we can talk about it in terms of ourselves as teachers. Berg and Sieber make the case that courses that are a joy to teach are those in which we feel most connected to others. So there's that emotional connection that's happening. being exhausted, overworked, and time deficient impact not only teachers' personal health, but their ability to teach in the classroom well. So we have additional reasons for thinking we need to have healthier relations to our work. And feelings are catchy, so study shows emotions spread, and classrooms are emotional communities. So thinking about being intentional about the emotions that we're spreading in classroom environments. There are some general concerns. So not all emotions are going to be helpful when it comes to supporting learning, empowerment, etc. Some of the concerns with regard to emotional responses are from Hoffman, namely emotional overloading. So one of them is empathetic overarousal, and this is when empathetic distress for the self overrides that for the other. So I'm engaging with somebody, I'm having an empathetic response, but it's so negative what I'm engaging with that I get so distressed that distancing myself from the source of that distress takes precedence over helping the person get through that distress. So you don't want to be over aroused such that you're unable to help. There's also compassion, fatigue, and indifference. With both of these, you've got this chronic experience of empathetic overarousal, and in some cases it makes you exhausted, and others it makes you indifferent. And there are also empathetic biases. So a few of them are the familiarity biases, the family of biases, which include in-group friendship and similarity bias. We tend to have rosier responses to those we're familiar with, and here and now bias speaks to situations where we as humans tend to respond in a much more visceral way if the thing that is generating empathy is right in front of us. If it's distant in time and space, then we're less likely to have as strong an empathetic response. Now, with regard to some of the concerns about emotion in the classroom, there are ways to cultivate healthy emotional response and moral emotional response. So participating in 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation has been shown to reduce implicit age and race bias and to reduce discrimination. And 7-minute exposures to loving kindness meditation, also known as meta meditation, directed towards a member of a racial outgroup, decreased racial bias towards that outgroup as measured by the implicit association test. And you can just search yourself at the beginning. How did your presence shift when you set aside all those worries and excitements that were taking up space and just created a space for learning? And also, what did the meditation and the sort of letting go do with focus? When it comes to climate change in particular, I was recently reading an article by Panu, and it very helpfully illustrated that we talk about these climate change emotions in broad ways. So eco-anxiety, climate anxiety. But if we're going to want to be careful, we're going to have to drill down and really think about context and really think about the particulars in terms of anxiety. Are we wanting to have a pathologizing notion of anxiety? So too in the classroom, I think that we need to attend to emotion in the classroom, but we also need to think about particular context, particular groups of learners, what's going to psychologically resonate in one case and not in another. If we're going to do this well, I'm really interested myself in the psychology of empowerment and activism and how to bring that into the classroom. And insofar as you're interested in empowerment and activism, I really think affective pedagogy needs quite a bit more attention. One of the emotions we've spent quite a bit of time talking about it is hope, and I'm not going to linger on it too much because we have already chatted about it, but it is a particularly important one. In my research, I found that hope is a precondition for action. It increases life satisfaction. It increases general well-being. It supports motivation, action, resilience. It's teachable. And I have citations for all of this. This is all lifted from the book. So if you're interested, there's lots and lots of evidence for these claims. I'm not going to go over all of these, but at the end of the book, I talk about a number of ways in which you might want to engage your students to bridge from theory to action. And as you can note, the last point is with teaching hope. I really do think that this is essential as environmental educators to engage with our students in ways that cultivate hope, just because the challenges are that significant. To this end, I would highly, highly, highly recommend the following. So when Ellen did their presentation, Hope Matters was sort of at the center of it. And I bought the book right after, and oh my goodness, I couldn't put it down. I'm going to have my capstone for $4.99, Ethics and Social Change students read it. If you're looking to empower your students, if you're looking for them to develop a grounded hope, so one that's informed by what's actually going on in the world, but also finding ways in which you can make a profound difference, this is the kind of literature I would strongly encourage. So too with Jennifer's Facing It podcast, a podcast about love, loss, in the natural world. I love that Jennifer is talking about love. That's not an emotion that gets talked about enough with regards to the environment. My students responded very strongly to this, feeling like voice was given to concerns that they weren't seeing reflected in other places. So it isn't a question. I make the case of whether emotion is active in the classroom. The question is how to intentionally engage emotion that is already in the classroom. So this is the book. Oh, it's at the bottom of a pile I was going to show you, that the content of the presentation came from. Oops. Sorry, I set my little timer so I would stop at 20 minutes, which is good because it's done. I really look forward to discussion.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I was trying to not take too many notes because I'm so absorbed in everything that you're saying, but I feel like I have like a whole pile of resources I want to run out and check into now. So let's go ahead and open this up to open discussion for everyone. Any questions, comments, insights, responses? Go ahead if you want to either raise your hand if you have that option on your Zoom function, or you can drop it into the chat and I'd be happy to get you to unmute and hear your voice here.
Hi, I'll ask a question. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was amazing. I wrote down a lot of citations that I want to look up later too. Everyone, my name is Jen Ladino. I teach at the University of Idaho, and I'm in the English department here, working on just starting to work on climate change emotions. I'm trained as an Americanist and have worked on emotions about the environment, kind of broadly speaking, for a long time, and mostly in literature, but also a little bit in tourism. And so I'm kind of learning a lot about sort of climate change related emotions and teaching a lot about that too. I also teach courses on affect theory pretty often, both at the graduate level and at the upper division undergraduate level. So I have just a quick vocabulary question for you, Lisa, that might get other people thinking too. How do you define the term affect and how do you distinguish it from emotion? Do you find that distinction useful for you when you're teaching in particular?
That's a fantastic question. And I'm very strategic in the book in terms of even defining emotion. And it's slippery. I feel like emotion and affect are both incredibly complex terms that get used in all kinds of contexts in different ways, in helpfully different ways, maybe in less helpfully different ways. And when I talk about emotion, I want to flag that mess, that very diverse, complex notion that we're working with called emotion. And then when it comes to specific discussions, I'll say, okay, in this context, this is what I'm talking about. When I'm referring to emotion, I'm referring to a socially constructed, politically relevant, blah, 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 blah. But thus far, I've been able to sort of back out of that question and be like, well, it depends on your context. What do you want to do with that concept? So yeah, in some contexts, it's absolutely helpful to make those sorts of distinctions. In others, you're like, emotion, affect, same difference. So I'm curious as for in terms of your experience, when do you find it useful to make those distinctions? And maybe which times do you find it less helpful to make those distinctions?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I mean, I think in my work and teaching, I tend to oversimplify emotion as a term and focus on the messiness of affect as a term, right? But I learned a lot. I think I could probably do a lot more to complicate both terms. Although I have had students finish my seminars and be like, okay, remind me what affect is again, because I really don't know. So I have a big vocabulary document that kind of spells out all the different ways that I've found that you can define these things. But again, I tend to focus more on affect, and the way I distinguish it that I think is helpful, at least from my own lived experience, is that the affect is sort of the kind of messy feelings that may or may not, grow into an emotion that takes a kind of narrative conscious form. And so I tend to
Gotcha.
like to think about it that way, that we have a lot of complicated feelings that we may or may not, that sort of simmer under the surface, that we may or may not sort of crystallize into these emotional states that then we can kind of talk about more clearly. But you're right that emotion is not always clear cut or straightforward either. It has its own set of complicated definitions and contexts. So yeah, I think
I also,
conversations are good to have.
I am so excited that you're talking about that with your students. And it's interesting to me that there are different emotion terms, both historically and geographically. So in terms of what constitutes an emotion and when, what exists as an emotion and when is really interesting. And some people do want to make the distinction between feelings, this sort of physiological experience, versus the emotion, which has this more cognitive element. Some people want to push against that, right? Like, why do you have to import this cognitive element for an emotion to be legitimate or relevant? So yeah, it's
especially if you want to break down that reason emotion binary, which I think we all do, and the science, everyone does, from science to cultural philosophy and everything in between, recognizes that doesn't really make sense. So
no, I mean, like, in terms of our biology and how physiologically reason and emotion interact, it's so hard to take them apart, right, and hold them as separate. So yeah.
So Heidi and Greta both have their hands up as well. Thanks for that, Jen.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you what your experiences are in the classroom, when do you draw the boundary in regards to emotion? Because I think, students can get really worked up in it. And sometimes I think it's helpful to kind of get an, rational distance. I don't know, where do you draw the boundary?
I think that's a fantastic question. And I think depending on your personality, that's going to be somewhere where you're going to have different comfort zones with what you feel is appropriate for the classroom in terms of emotional sharing. I also think, for myself anyways, it depends on that particular classroom environment. So I've got some classes that are upper classes, they're smaller. I've been working with these students for years. They're really at liberty to share in ways, and people respond in those classes differently. If it's an intro class, everyone's sort of meeting each other. I myself probably gravitate toward making more space for emotion in the class. Like, if a student is having a moment, I say, thank you for your vulnerability and for sharing. If you feel comfortable, we can continue talking. If you want to just take a moment, that's fine too. Thank you for bringing that to class. Obviously, there are going to be circumstances where it's not going to be healthy for the student to continue in a highly emotional state for extended periods of time, perhaps in class, but I really think it depends. How long have you been talking about these things? What kind of environment have you created? What's your experience been, Heidi, in terms of students sharing?
I just distinctly remember this one moment when we were watching a film, and then one student broke down crying, and she was like, I have to travel, across the country every week, and I feel so guilty about the traveling. And, she was getting so worked up in something I considered really minor. And then, I'm wondering, when do you draw the distinction between somebody, having a healthy emotional, breakout, and the sense when you go like, oh, maybe that person should see a psychologist, where do you draw the line and how do you articulate that? I find that difficult. And also, kind of having the responsibility, you don't want the people to be alone with the burden, but at the same time, you're the professor, it's not your job to take care of their emotional well-being. And I think sometimes female professors get, I don't want to say abuse, but I mean, there's a study out there that female professors spend way more time talking to students about their personal issues than male professors do. And that again breaks down into how much money you get per hour, how much time you spend working, blah, blah, blah. So I think this is another entire other discussion that has to be led at some point. So I don't know.
Absolutely. So you've not only got the denigration of emotions in terms of thinking about affect in the classroom, the work that's associated with emotions is undervalued. So emotional labor is undervalued. And the longer I've been working in academia, the larger the burden has been for me. And part of it's my personality. I'm like, let's talk about emotions. But yeah, it takes up a ton of time and energy. And I don't know about you, I find that when you're talking in a quote unquote non-emotional way with students about ideas, sometimes you have to bring it in again, even there. So somebody might start going off on a tangent about some idea, and it's a skill, right? It's hard to cultivate, and sometimes you're successful, other times not so much, where you're like, okay, let's bring it back to this idea for a minute. And I like how it connects with this idea. So rather than going into this huge other area, you just sort of bring it back to the focus. If you're not wanting to have that sort of that emotional sort of explosion in class or what have you. It's complicated. I don't think there are straightforward answers, but I think they're really important questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Greta, I want to get you up on the screen here, and then I've got a couple of chat questions that I'll follow up with that I can read off after Greta.
Well, I've been trying to shape this clay into a comment and question. There's so many wonderful ideas, Lisa. I came in 5 minutes late from another call, and I just hope that this is being recorded, or we can see the PowerPoint from the beginning. So okay, good, because this is really valuable. So first, to kind of out myself, my dissertation was on anger in women's novels. I wrote it in 1987 through 89. It was finished in 89. There was nothing like that. The field was called emotionology at the time. And I was bringing a feminist perspective in, which it seems you are doing, Lisa, and looking at the way that emotions are gendered. And it seemed to me that anger was like the doorway, because it was the one emotion allowed to men and the one emotion denied to women. And so anger was like a form of speaking out, the power of self-defense, self-assertion, as well as saying stop, So my first general question is, in what ways have you brought or been open, because you are bringing it, I think, open about bringing a feminist perspective to your discussion of this? So that's one thing. Then I'm thinking about the racialized construction of anger. We know about ABW, the angry Black woman, how anger is denied to Black women, it's punished, and yet it's seen to characterize Black women. And so I think there's just like a wealth of unpacking just waiting there in terms of race and gender. And the third thing is sort of not a question, so I love that you're doing mindfulness. And I started exploring that too, like around 1995, but when I went to the Mind and Life Research Institute in New York, I met Dan Siegel. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Okay. And so this is for everybody. So he has this meditation, which is on his website, and it's called the Wheel of Awareness. And I strongly recommend the 30-minute meditation, because the shorter ones just won't get you there. But what happens with the Wheel of Awareness is that he takes you through the steps of what are called dependent origination. That is the becoming of form and consciousness and self-identity, and what leads to craving. And when you go to the center of the hub of the Wheel of Awareness, if you are a mindfulness practitioner, which you are, Lisa, you can see it happen just in rapid fire of the sense doors opening, contact, the affect, the naming, which Jen talks about, and then the narrative with the naming, and then the craving comes up. I don't know if I can lead my students through that, but it's tremendously useful. I'm just not sure what I'm going to do with it yet, but so back to you on the gendering of emotions and the racialized features of emotions. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I have spent a lot of time talking about anger. Audre Lorde always comes to mind immediately, right? In terms of being at a conference and a white woman telling her to sort of could you just reframe that? Could you make that a little more gentle? And Lord flipping the table and saying, what are you afraid of? The content of my words or the method of delivery? Like, this is, you need to hear this and don't silence me. Like the expression of anger is itself a judgment. And when you take that away from someone, you're taking away power. So what you were referring to in terms of anger being this really, again, in the Western tradition, really unique emotion where men are allowed and expected to be angry because it has that judgment attached to it, all the way back to Aristotle. And the ways in which anger is denied to so many and reclaiming that anger. So in the piece, one of the pieces you mentioned, Jennifer, about emotional outlaws, I make the case that, and this is old hat to you, Greta, this is just coming from the feminist literature, but getting angry at a racist joke in company where some people are laughing, that's going to make you an outsider, that's going to make you an affective alien, a la Sarah Ahmed. But it's exactly the right moral response to have. So too, when it comes to climate change, it's not going to make you popular at Christmas to say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you took a plane here and you bought all of these gifts. These are destined for the dump. Like, do you have any idea what's going on in the world right now? It's not going to make you popular. But having different emotional responses and articulating them is an act of activism, I'd make the case. So when it comes to both gender and all the folks who are othered in different ways, including race, the reason emotion dualism doesn't just fall along the lines of gender, emotion gets associated with oppressed groups generally. So sort of unpacking that and thinking about how that impacts how people are read, what emotions they're enabled to express. I have a view of emotion where emotions happen in relationship. You've got someone who's trying to express. So you've got somebody who's trying to express emotion, and then you've got an interpreter, and that interpreter can give uptake. So this is from Marilyn Frye, to the expressor, the would-be expressor, or they can fail to. And sometimes you're unable to have a clear expression of an emotion because you're not getting uptake. So when it comes to any attempts at emotional expression, there's power dynamics in the background. That's just like a little tiny glaze of some of the thoughts with your really wonderful questions, Greta. And then with regard to the meditation practice, if it's a half an hour, I would recommend play it in class. Just let the students listen to, I have had students participate in meditation in class. I always say there's no obligation here. Some people feel discomfort around this, blah, 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 but they have been incredibly receptive. And for myself, because I was trained in the Vipassana tradition, that coming back to your breath and being able to let go of thoughts, that creates an entirely different way of acting in the world, where instead of reacting, you're given the pause to respond. And you get to know yourself, you get to know your emotional self, you get to know your thinking self in ways where you can renegotiate that relationship. So I think there's all kinds of exciting work still to be done with regard to meditative practices in learning environments generally.
Muting myself. Okay, we've got a bunch of questions that are popping up in the chat as well. I'm going to lump one of them together because there's a side conversation happening here with some responses. So if any of you from the chat actually want to unmute yourself and clarify, or but Lisa, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this. So Jen's put in the chat, do you think action-oriented education may be a good emotion channeler to work the confusion and pain that arises from environmental loss? For example, working with a group of kids on a forest restoration project. And then Heather responded in relation to Jen's question, do you think it can be dangerous to move too quickly to channel emotions into action rather than sitting with and exploring confusion, grief, etc., recognizing not all teachers may feel prepared to act as therapists, but what is the risk of moving into action as a way of, again, sidelining and excluding emotion? And then I'll also note Britt Ray has chimed in there, included some links and resources. So maybe we could kind of unpack that for a few minutes here.
Amazing, thank you. I'm sorry, I can only do one thing at a time.
Sorry about that.
My poor students, right? Because I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't read the chat. I'm concentrating on what you're saying. So I'm really bad at noticing the chat. with regard to this idea of just sitting with emotion, I was reminded of a conversation that I had with George Yancey, who happened to sit beside me at a conference that I was at. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're George Yancey, who wrote Dear White America. And I had said to him, like, I teach at a predominantly white institution. What do you think my students should be taking away from the piece? Their response tends to be, what can I do? What can I do? Tell me now, what can I do? And what he said was, I'd really like for these white kids to just sit with it. Sit with that discomfort. Don't try to fix it right away. Don't try to make everything better. That's not what is going to, that's not an approach that allows the rich emotional engagement that's required for long-term change. So I thought that was very powerful in terms of the import of sitting with it. And do I think there's concerns to be had about emotional shifts happening really quickly in the classroom? Sure, but anyone who's taught existential philosophy, right? You're encouraging these rapid shifts in thinking that profoundly affect you as an individual. So I think we do this even when we're not talking specifically about emotional growth. And yeah, the question about being therapists in the classroom, and I discuss that in the book, because people will rightly be concerned that we've not been trained as therapists, it's not our job. I'd make the case, though, part of that response is because there's that assumption about the reason emotion dualism, right? As though when you're engaging with your student, you're not engaging with a whole person. And you have to address all the components of that human being if you're going to have a really rich emotional educational experience. So I don't have a good answer, but I do think, yes, you've got to worry about pushing into the domain of being a full-on therapist. But I also think part of the concern about having anything dealing with students' emotions in the class is attached to that reason-emotion dualism, which I question in and of itself. I'm forgetting things. There are some other things you mentioned, Jennifer. And other people, please jump in. Oh my goodness, I'd love to hear other voices to any of these questions.
I know that Ben was also trying to get his hand up, so I'm gonna have him unmute himself, and Penu also had his hand up in response to all of this, so we'll get the two of them up here on screen.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my name is Ben. I'm from Manchester Metropolitan University in Manchester in the UK, and I'm part of the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies. So I'm a youth studies sociologist, really. My work is on young climate activism, which is why I attended our first conference, which was great. Thank you for speaking to us. The talk in the sidebar made me think of the work that I've done with young activists and how often they use emotion as a tool, and not just as something that moves them to action, but as the action itself. And it made me think of the ways that in young activism, quite often they're excluded from, quite directly excluded from the kind of deliberative democratic fora that other people, you know, older people and people like me can access because of the way we speak and our social capital and all that stuff. So I was thinking of a couple of examples of things that could help out maybe with our toolkit arising from it. One of them was the work of the, I know Jennifer Atkinson knows because she was quite interviewed by it, the student guide for the climate crisis in Manchester, where two students, along with some of their friends, wrote a really fantastic guide for responding to the climate crisis that involved really mixing and matching and mishmashing and remixing feelings of grief with using those feelings. The work of activists, there are a lot of Americans here, I'd say. The Sunrise Movement that does a lot of singing. I mean, if you go into somebody's office, like Nancy Pelosi's office, sure, you can write to them and you can lay out data, or you can sing. And if you're singing, you can't be ignored. You know, that affective action is very effective, especially if you're excluded from some of the more kind of pretending to be rational, rationalistic ways of talking. And the other one that I thought of, and it's not a climate related one, but I always use it in teaching students about activism, is Analicia Mejia Messinas' work with the school pupils who were on a Demilitarize Our Schools project, and they won in Los Angeles. And the way that they went to the school governors meeting and really put their emotions in front. Held up big signs with the weapons that the police were being armed with, and said, how would you feel? Because you can tell how we feel. And so, so yeah, I think there's a lot that we could do, and and I was grateful for your talk in the way that you talked about emotion, looking at emotion in a way that that kind of responded to how young people are not just kind of questioning that dualism, and not even just subverting it, but really mixing it all up in really interesting ways that it's hard to keep up with, but are really, yeah, exciting and interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the singing example. So thinking about what sorts of affective engagement are effective. Oftentimes, and this goes back to your question, Greta, if you meet somebody with anger, you tend to get defensiveness, right? If instead, and I talk about this with the theater students at the University of Evansville, we've got a really great theater program about the sort of activism that's possible when you're coming from a theatrical sort of presentation, because that's not pointing your finger at someone and saying what you're doing is wrong. It's an invitation to a story to think through some of these really, really heated topics, but without having that response of anger and defensiveness. So I really think as activists, it's important to address how emotion is functioning there. And what you said reminded me in terms of the question of students and them feeling too quickly, too intense of emotions. In my classes, when students do their action projects, they decide what they want to do. They decide how they want to engage. They decide what feels right for them. And I have some people who are like full on out there wanting to be active, and that's what they do. And other people are taking little baby steps, like maybe I will write a letter to this representative. So it really reflects where they're at. So rather than me having some goal that you need to do X or Y by the end of the course, I just want you to feel like you're empowered to act in the world. I'm going to give you a bunch of tools. You choose whatever you want, whatever feels comfortable, but just start to feel what it's like to engage with the world more fully, not just in this classroom, but outside of the classroom. Thank you.
Panu has his hand up as well.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Special thanks to Lisa and everybody else, and also connects nicely with our previous session where there was also talk about emotions. And I've often been writing and talking about the dark emotions, but I see a lot of connection with what Lisa is saying here. Part of that focus of mine is because they have been given so little attention in writing. So for example, careful use of humor is something that I do myself also, and that requires caution, of course. Catherine Van Kessel has written interestingly about that recently, but just a couple of notes, because Jen is a polite, modest person. I recommend her and Kyle Bladow's introduction to this book on affective eco-criticism if somebody wants to read about affects and environmental studies. That's been, at least for me, very, very helpful, making some clarity of the use of the term affect by human geographers and you name it. I already recommended Lisa's work in the last session also, but just today, actually, my second main work of the year was published, an article called Eco-Anxiety and Environmental Education. So if you have time sometime, for example, in January, perhaps where there's more light in the world, then there's a large discussion about literature in environmental education about emotion and affect. So I'll put the link to the chat. But thanks much.
Thank you so much, Panu. I'm actually really curious what you think about what level of emotional engagement is appropriate within a classroom, particularly around these dark emotions that you write about. And I'm also curious in your own teaching, how you navigate that, if you're willing to share.
Yeah, thanks for asking. In the previous session, we did this mind map exercise, which is probably going to be in the toolkit also. So that's sort of safe because it helps people to get in touch with the emotions, feelings, affects, but it also retains a sort of cognitive dimension, and then one can sort of take a look at what are the embodied signals that people are showing. Now I put in the chat this chance for embodied activities. I couldn't think of a better word for this, but it's a sort of anything that involves bodily movement and gets our body minds moving. And personally, I always find it greatly relieving if I can do that. It's terrible sometimes in academic situations where people are just, sitting in an auditorium, and then it's tricky, especially with ecological grief, I would say. This arises from me teaching mostly people who are concerned about environmental issues, and then there's a whole lot of complicated grief, as you well know. Lisa has written to this wonderful article collection about mourning nature, for example. So I've had several cases, for example, doing the spectrum line of ecological emotions, which might also be in the toolkit soon, where I realized that these people have so much grief inside them that now really great sensitivity is needed. And of course, I also structure activities like the spectrum line so that there's first strengthening things and sort of reconnaissance of what is this group of people like. Then if the situation allows, I go into some of the more difficult ones, most notably grief and guilt, because they are so central. But then one needs to have a sort of escape route, so to say ready, that what do we do after the grief part. But my experience is that if you then again get people moving and sharing, the sort of energy inherent in people lifts them up. So I've never had anyone break down in the sessions, but of course I do have quite a long history of facilitating these kind of sessions. So it's tricky. On one hand, I side with you and others in emphasizing that one doesn't need to be a therapist to do this kind of things, but the more powerful methodology one uses, for example, with embodied movement and discussion, then the more care and skills are needed. So thanks for asking. Sorry for answering so long, but it's so complicated.
No, I think that's great. And students even just becoming aware that they're having emotional responses as they're doing readings can be really helpful as they're having these discussions. Kathy Cook has an example where they encourage their students as they're reading to note their affect in the margin as they're going along, and then going back and reflecting. How did that shape your reading? How did that shape your response? And I thought that was really interesting. And I just wanted to share, oftentimes the person I'm most concerned about, getting overly emotional is me in the classroom. I mean, I am so emotionally impacted by this material, and I'm not ashamed to say that I have cried in class. We were doing the treatment of non-human animals, and I've been vegan for a really long time. It's close to my heart. And at one point I'm like, and they still do this to these animals that are, and I'm starting to cry. And of course the students are like, it's okay, Dr. Kretz, it's getting better. And I'm like, not fast enough. Like, it was this very honest engagement. They were a lovely group. They were very generous. But yeah, I think there's some wonderful growth that's available when we ourselves share with our students in that way, when we ourselves show that this is impacting us this deeply. Yeah, I know we're close to time. I don't know if you wanted to try one more or.
Yeah, there were so many great questions in the chat. I feel like I've completely lost track of things, so I apologize to everyone. I'm not really the best moderator because I don't know who can actually listen and read at the same time. It's like a skill that I don't have, but I've really been focusing on the actual conversation. I did see one pop up though that I don't know that we addressed. So, and Ellen Field, if you want to chime in here just to clarify, but I was looking at your comment in the chat. curious to know if Lisa or others are familiar with studies that have looked into large-scale uptake of mental and well-being in public schools that have helped teachers address eco anxiety, climate despair with students.
Anybody else can jump in. I think there are lots of publications that address it. Not no one publication fully, but this area of study is burgeoning. And there are some broad examples. I'm not going to be able to drop names off the top of my head, but people who are really interested in exploring how to do this well, for lack of a better. Anyone else can jump in though, please do.
I think somebody else actually put a research. Andrew Bryant has a the Emotional Resilience Toolkit for Climate Work that's been put together with therapists. I don't know if it's that specifically, but I've actually taken a look at that link before, and it's incredibly comprehensive. So I urge everybody to save the chat. I'll do so as well in case you forget. And if you want to send me an email, I can send this to you because there's so many resources that have been popping up over on that side. Well, before we conclude, any other lingering questions or comments that folks wanted to make there? Let me put one more item in the chat over here. We heard just briefly from Ben Bowman asking a question and providing some context as well about youth activism and engagement. And Ben is actually going to be facilitating our next discussion on December 15th. So I put that link up there. And I'll come back and revisit this next time as well. But include our fall lineup for this discussion group. I'm happy to continue this through the winter if other folks want to come forward and facilitate, so I can send out an email. And I mean, really all my work is just putting together a Zoom link and introducing somebody really fabulous, and I think the group really takes it from there. So if you're thinking about you might want to facilitate any of these conversations, please reach out to me, but I'm happy to put together a new lineup going into the winter. And it seems like there is a lot of enthusiasm around this. So, all right. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for your insights. This was such a packed conversation. I feel like all of this is going to be spilling over into the discussions to come. So with that, I will go ahead and wrap us up here. I'm going to save the chat. And if anybody does want to reach out to me, if they weren't able to get that, please send me an email. But again, thank you, Lisa, and thanks to all of you for your fabulous insights and questions and resources. This was a really generative discussion.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I learned so much.